Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here for this talk with Matthew Engel, who is wonderful. And I'm so excited to have you here, Matthew.
Pleasure. Thank you, Martha, for pulling this whole thing together.
Yeah.
I can see it's a rather Herculean effort to gather so many amazing speakers as part of the symposium. So I'm just really honoring the efforts and the love that you have put out there to do it.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's, divinely directed and therefore divinely happening. And it's a total pleasure for me. So thank you. So today we're going to be talking about the way the title you have come up with for your talk is beautiful, which is Embodying the Sacred Masculine, a Sexual, Relational, and Spiritual Journey into Love for Queer Men. And when you sent me the title, I seriously almost started crying. I'm almost going to start crying now because this topic, this is exactly why I wanted to hold this symposium. I mean, again, this was a divinely directed thing, but me, Martha, the human, this topic, it touches on so much of what is key to me and what feels pivotal for us in this time on this planet and changing the way that we interact with gender, sexuality, all of the above. And it touches on the fact that, in my perspective, from what I see in the world, our conversations around gender and sexuality tend to be pretty heterocentric.
Definitely.
Yes. And that is deeply upsetting for me. So,
Sure.
I appreciate you bringing in this topic for so many reasons on so many levels. And I honestly think that this kind of conversation is what is going to change our world. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. But before
Thank you. And likewise, by the way. Yeah.
But before we start, I just want to read a little bit of your bio so people have a sense of who you are. And I'll also say, when we first connected, it's bizarre how much we have in common.
Right? I know you're like my other whole in terms of our parallels professionally, spiritually, integratively with mental health and spirituality and psychic stuff and astrology. It was so cool. Yeah.
It was so funny. I mean, even the fact that we both we got our master's degrees in clinical social work in Massachusetts,
right,
like in a couple
at the same time, like around the same era. Yeah.
All right, 25 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever it's been, a long time ago.
A long time ago. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so your bio says Matthew Engel, LCSW CHT, is a psychotherapist, coach, and astrologer who specializes in the integration of emotional and spiritual transformation on the deepest levels. With a passion for consciousness raising, Matthew has assisted thousands of clients in finding their way into authenticity and wholeness. A gay man and a lifelong seeker, Matthew began studying astrology and other metaphysical topics as a teen. Same. Throughout his 25-year career, he has taught psychic development and channeling courses over 100 times, hosted the podcast show Intuitive Transformation Radio for several years, has been a well-regarded speaker for the National Association of Social Workers, wonderful, San Francisco Astrological Society, myriad spiritual groups and wellness events, and numerous podcast and radio programs. He has written dozens of articles about psychological and spiritual growth, astrology, and the evolution of the collective consciousness, and is slowly writing a book about integrative healing. Earlier this year, he began to collaboratively develop a series of online astrology talks and classes with Tara Sutphen.
Sutphen, yeah.
Yes. Matthew resides in San Francisco. He is a dog dad who loves the ocean and has a zeal for social justice. Matthew is known for blending his Cancerian nurturing with a sense of humor and direct, no-nonsense style. Super awesome. Thank you
Indeed.
so much for being here.
Pleasure. It's my pleasure.
So where do you want to start? Why is this topic important to you?
This topic is important to me on multiple levels. Let's start just with some of the clinical variables that I think are important to highlight. Just identifying some of the risk factors for queer men. When compared to the general population, queer men have an exponentially higher rate of depression, suicidality, low self-esteem, substance abuse. They have much higher rates of not withholding from alcohol and drug use as they get older into 30s, 40s, midlife and beyond, continuing into later life, compared to the general population that may have a greater tendency statistically to cut back on some of that as they get further into adulthood. The prevalence of clinical depression, according to the CDC and the American Journal of Men's Health, is 3 times higher among queer men than the general adult population. And suicide is the #1 cause of death among men, and queer men have a higher risk of suicide than heterosexual men.
Yikes.
Yeah. So I think just, from kind of a flatline clinical standpoint, as a psychotherapist, it's really important that any of us who are working in the mental health field, and even the, non-mental health credentialed helping professionals, because I know we have some really wonderful folks who are part of this symposium who may not necessarily have a psychotherapy licensure, but they're doing really wonderful depth work and personal development work with clients around the world. So I think anyway, slice it, it's really important for us to be aware of certain risk factors. Then beyond the clinical stuff, this journey is also very personal for me as a cisgender gay identified man. Having grown up in conservative lily white suburbia in the 70s and 80s, with a dad who was kind of a guy's guy. He had been a lifelong athlete and jock and fraternity brother and a coach, and socialized in those kinds of peer groups. And then having gone to college, undergrad anyway, in a very small town, very small town, Oswego, New York. There were a lot of messages with which I grew up around what being a man was meant to look like, and how I was supposed to act, how I was supposed to behave, what I was supposed to think, how I was supposed to feel, how I was supposed to talk, how I was supposed to leverage my body language, my mannerisms, what interests I was supposed to have and shouldn't have. A degree of judgment around emotionality or sensitivity. That was particularly difficult as a budding gay man, #1, but also as someone who's very much an empath and a feeler and a perceiver, and who really has always soaked in porously the energy around me. So, and knowing that I didn't really fit into any of that. And certainly I am not alone in having grown up with that particular type of messaging. And I think that type of messaging, it plays a huge role in some of the mental health related issues that are so prevalent among queer men. And I'll talk more about that as we progress into our discussion. My full-fledged coming out process, which, although it had started and was very gradual over the course of several years, Oswego, New York in the early 90s was not exactly the most conducive place to come out, nor was Long Island, New York. in the late 80s or early 90s. So I was not out as a teen. By the time I landed in graduate school in Boston in the mid to late 90s, at that point I was in my early to mid 20s, that was the time where I really full-fledged went through a full-fledged coming out process, which at that point actually was quite liberating. However, shortly thereafter, when I found myself living in what was then contemporary gay male or queer male urban society in a cosmopolitan area, in a seemingly progressive city, I was also very aware that I was surrounded by image and body obsessed men, gay men, with a very shallow image obsessed demeanor. There were a lot of older gay men who just seemed kind of creepy in the way that they'd kind of hit on me and eyeball me or try to touch me inappropriately in public settings. And I ended up finding before long, even though I was in therapy at the time and really feeling good about coming out, and I was launching my adult identity and adult self, and was living in a city in which I felt on many levels that I could thrive and come alive and grow professionally, I also found myself before long feeling more emotionally isolated and relationally isolated as a recently out young gay man than I had felt when I was largely in the closet and hiding in years prior. And that played a significant role in my own mental health, where I really struggled with a lot of depression and isolation. I never felt like I was good enough. I never felt like I was attractive enough. I never felt like my body was perfect enough. I never felt like I fit in. It seemed very difficult for me to find other gay men with whom I could connect on a deeper, more intimate level, which I was craving significantly. And I can remember coming to this sort of like proclamation by the time I was about 25 or so. And it's interesting because there are, in fact, a handful of friends who were in my life then, among different genders and sexual orientations, who are still in my life, who remember me actually saying this, that after a handful of dating experiences in which I felt kind of burned and bruised by people who just either couldn't go to deeper levels, or who were more shallow, or who weren't working on themselves, or who didn't have a depth or a sincerity, or just kind of where it wasn't an energetic, emotional, psychological, relational fit, I felt very burned and bruised and thought that was something that was because of something wrong with me. And I really just kind of made this proclamation that, well, because of my sensitivity and because of my depth and because of who I am in the world, it's going to take a really long time and it's going to be really difficult for me to find the right man for me in partnership, if it even happens at all. And in the meantime, well, I have a set of physical needs that need to get taken care of, so I'm just going to take care of that, which I then channeled through casual sex. And I did a lot of that. Not as much as a lot of other gay guys that I know, but definitely was out there, engaging in casual sex. And that for me was a way of numbing. It was a way of self-medicating a deeper need for a deeper degree of relational connectedness. And I think with any given hookup or attempted hookup, even if there was some kind of conscious separation of sex from intimacy, which I could do for a while, there was always kind of this underlying yearning that, okay, maybe this person who I hook up with or go out on a date with will end up being the one. And to be very clear, it's not like I was having casual sex on a daily basis by any means. But there was definitely a pattern in which I kept kind of going back for more of something that wasn't really serving what I knew on a deeper level that I really wanted and yearned for and needed. And that kind of played out throughout my 20s and even into my early 30s, through a good couple of rounds of therapy and a lot of spiritual development work. And eventually, as I was kind of approaching my late 30s, I ended up doing a couple of years of 12-step work around sex and relationship kinds of themes. And I never particularly identified as an addict or anything like that, but I was aware that I had a series of relational patterns in which I kind of kept going back for more of something that wasn't really serving me, and certainly wasn't fulfilling the purpose and the objective, which was about a deeper level of connectedness. And in a sort of non-clinical way, we can define addiction as a lack of connection and lack of intimacy. And that is something that so many queer men are chasing. They're chasing a pattern. They're chasing something. They have a pattern of chasing something that isn't really serving or filling the need that's occurring on a deeper level. And different people are aware of that to differing variations, because certainly there's a continuum of self-awareness out there in society, as you well know, as most of us know. And whether that cycle of more addictive behavior is playing out sexually, relationally, through codependence, through an overabundance of working really, really hard, of material, an excessive focus on materialism, on having the perfect body, or for folks on the extreme opposite who may struggle with more compulsive overeating, for folks who are struggling with any number of different drugs and alcohol, substance abuse. And as we established at the beginning of this talk, certainly queer men statistically have much higher rates of all of those things than heterosexual men, and certainly the general population. So this journey, as I talk about embodying the sacred masculine, is very much a parallel process, and it's the culmination of a great deal of inner work that I've done over the last 25 or more years, personally and also professionally. With everything that I bring to the world professionally, I always view some degree of parallel process between the clients whom I serve, and something that I've gone through in my life or go through in my life. Certainly, I have to do my own work, as any therapists and helping professionals need to do. But the journey is something that's been very deeply personal, that I know is just one example of something that affects the collective within the the sub segments of the population of queer men. And there's also been just an epic degree of healing and embodiment of my own feeling of connectedness with the sacred masculine that I've gone through over the years. Particularly, I would say, over the last 5 to 8 years. And that has just been so salient and given rise to a deeper body of work that I'm offering to the world professionally. So that's a little bit of how this talk came to be. Of course, through invitation and your just incredible, divinely arranged invitation. But I was so excited, as when we spoke a few weeks ago, and we really had a synergy going as I brought up the possibility of speaking about this subject, because it's also a topic that I'm doing some writing on, and there are one or probably two books that are kind of gestating and in the works right now around some of this stuff. Some of the themes that we can talk more about around images and expectations for masculinity, I think pertain to the general male population as well as queer men. So it's not exclusive to queer men, but certainly queer men have a set of even higher risk factors than heterosexual men. And by queer men, I'm using that queer as an umbrella term to include gay, bisexual, trans, non-binary, pansexual. So, kind of the full gamut. Queer, to me, as it is for a lot of people contemporarily, is really more of an umbrella term. Mm-hmm. that I think it's important to really be inclusive in that way. And my hope is that for any heterosexual identified cisgender men out there who may be listening, that some of this may be eye-opening or inspiring for you as well, because there's still the messaging that a lot of us grow up with is still the same, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I even feel in myself, as someone who identifies pretty much as a cisgender female, right? As I hear you even talking about this, I have so many questions. And then I also can feel the reverberations of any healing that goes on for you coming back to me, because anyway, I can say more, but do you want me to ask you a question?
Sure.
Do you have more that you wanted to say there?
Well, if you have a question to ask, absolutely. Otherwise, I definitely have more to say in segue.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a question I would love answered at some point.
Sure,
and you can fit it in anywhere you want, but I would love to hear what the divine masculine means to you, and what is that? So you can answer that now or wherever you want.
Yeah, that's such an important question. I'll bullet point it for now, and yes, let's definitely go back and talk about it in greater depth as we proceed. To me, the divine masculine embodies a set of characteristics. First and foremost is self-love.
Wow.
And self-love comes through acceptance of self and honoring the uniqueness of self. The facets of ourselves that perhaps we can't change because they're kind of just programmed into our DNA or our soul vibration. And maybe the parts of ourselves that we can choose to express or not. And how we regulate our sense of identity, our sense of expression, our sense of relating, interpersonally, socially, professionally, in our outward demeanor and in our deeper, more intimate relationships, socially and romantically. So all of it really comes down to acceptance and self-love, and the varying layers of strength that are woven into that. And I think that's important to further expand upon as we proceed through the talk. There's a lot more, I think, to be said about it that I'd like to get to as we plug through some other points first, though. But I'm really glad that you put that question out there early on in the chat, so that we could at least begin to highlight for folks some of the salient characteristics of sacred masculinity, of the sacred masculine.
Cool.
Yeah. Generally speaking, as males, so many of us for many generations have grown up with an expectation for behavior, for emotions and emotional regulation, emotional expression, for communication styles, for body type, for dress, for how their voice is used, for appearance on all levels, for the image that is presented to the world, for a way in which assertiveness is defined and expressed, for ideas and templates that we form about sex. And that's a whole subtopic that I'd like to talk about in a few minutes. For what is defined as intimacy. And I think the intimacy piece gets really complicated, or complex anyway, because messaging around intimacy is often much more covert than it is overt. There are messages around what kind of work we should do, how we should define our work, what function our work or our careers may serve, particularly in supporting others with money, how we assign a sense of value to ourselves and our work, and therefore our self-worth. And then going back to intimacy, themes of vulnerability and weakness, and what it means to be strong physically, emotionally, verbally, in terms of presence. And so much of that gets into a set of terminology that has started to kind of really weave its way through pop culture and personal development circles in recent years. And that term, of course, is toxic masculinity, which, and there are so many different coaches and personal development, self-professed gurus who are talking toxic masculinity. And some of them are doing really great work. And what I see even among a lot of folks who are teaching, coaching, and preaching around toxic masculinity, a lot of men, that is, who are teaching around that subject, is that so much of their repertoire, so much of the imagery is centered around working out at the gym and getting muscular and taking care of yourself by taking care of your body because you love yourself, and therefore you get your body into a particular condition, and so on and so forth. I think we may have talked about this a couple of weeks ago. To me, it's a little bit comical to see a lot of these like personal growth gurus, you know, who are doing their marketing with not a whole heck of a lot more substance than like posing in a yoga pose with the muscle shirt and the gym outfit, or the yoga pose and that kind of thing. And it's like, okay, great. And of course there are women doing that as well, but there's so much more to self-love and growth and depth than just taking care of the physical body. I'm not diminishing the importance of taking care of the physical body as part of a larger repertoire of self-care. But there's so much more to it than that. And taking care of the body comes in multiple levels, and I think we can each have a different kind of relationship with the body. For some, maybe it does involve running 7 miles a day, or hiking mountains, or pumping at the gym, or doing 6 yoga classes a week. And for others, the body type may be completely different, but we can still be consuming food, we can still be engaging in activities that are done lovingly, regardless of body type. Regardless of weight, regardless of personal style, and so forth. So that I think is really important.
That goes for all genders.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, certainly there's a lot. Our society is riddled with image obsession and messaging around what health and nutrition and wellness is supposed to look like physically. And let's face it, among queer men, body obsession is a rampant problem. And there's actually quite a bit of eating disordered and body dysmorphia that occurs among queer men. I have worked with queer men in my private practice who are coming to therapy because they feel that they have a problem with emotional overeating, and it's making them overweight, and then subsequently articulated that, quite literally, I'm using actual case examples, that they believe that they are 3 pounds overweight.
Oh no. Oh
3
no.
pounds.
No.
Yeah.
I think I gain and lose 3 pounds every day. I don't know.
Yeah, right. You and me both. And I've worked with some women who work in the fashion industry, who have done fashion design and who work with models who are like a size 0 and all of this stuff, who have playfully said to me, oh yeah, you gay guys, that's like even worse than in my industry.
Wow.
So, like body obsession, even coming from some women I know, heterosexual identified women who work in image obsessed industries, among queer men, it's like really out there.
No.
And then I think the opposite can play out, because oftentimes when we don't feel good about our bodies, when we're getting this perpetual messaging of lack of self-worth, and there's already depression and there's already low self-esteem, that can lead to a vicious cycle of overeating or substance abuse and so on and so forth. So there's a ripple effect. I don't want to focus entirely on body image. I want to really flag that, and I think we've accomplished that mission. But there's so much more to embodying the sacred masculine and the divine masculine. But certainly among queer men, I think the body obsession theme is part of it. Coming into healthy relationship with the body, regardless of what our body types happen to be. I think that is part of divine masculine, as it is divine feminine, I suppose. So anyway, going back to some of the messaging that so many of us have received around what it means to be a man and how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to behave, what kinds of professions we're supposed to have. And let's face it, even contemporarily, if you look at certain professions, they are very heavily male dominated or female dominated. The tech sector, engineering, medicine, the sciences, banking. These all, by the way, happen to be higher wage earning careers, are very statistically male dominated.
Yeah.
And careers like mental health, social work, human service,
teaching,
nonprofit, teaching, absolutely. Spiritual development and work. And social workers, you and I, that's our background in clinical social work, very heavily female dominated. So if you think about it, there's a root to that phenomenon in messaging that people receive around what's expected of them, what's expected of us. Certainly some of those statistical trends are shifting. We are living in a time where gender roles are shifting. And I really believe, and we could tie some of this in astrologically, that in the broadest sense, those of us who were born in the Pluto in Libra generation, or in the Uranus in Libra years, those of us who were born particularly the early to mid 70s, throughout most of the 70s actually, as we are now in midlife, that transformational quality, we think of the archetype of Libra around balance and the scales of justice, there is a revamping of gender roles, norms, and expectations. And certainly we're seeing more of that even among cisgendered heterosexual couples, where there is a growing prevalence of couples and families where the female is more the breadwinner or works in a profession that may have been more traditionally male and vice versa. So we're seeing changes in the trends, but statistically, we are still in a society that is very conventional and not all that different than 50 or 70 years ago, the generation in which our parents grew up, 1950s America.
Just ask any mom. Well, just take a poll of moms, people who identify as women,
yep,
who have children, and regardless of their partner, anyway, take a poll of moms and see how many have a partner, especially a partner who's a man or an ex-partner who's a man, who is doing anywhere near equal. You will have a very hard time finding any.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It does exist.
It does exist.
More so than 60 years ago, 70 years ago, but it's still, the proportions are way out of balance.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to queer men, Alan Downs, in his well-known book, The Velvet Rage, he's a psychologist in Southern California who wrote the book, The Velvet Rage, which a lot of queer men are aware of. One of the themes that he talked about in that book is that because queer men grow up oftentimes feeling less than on so many different levels, not to mention themes of bullying and all of that, which is statistically still rampantly high, even among queer youth. Very often that experience of feeling less than adds a sense of internal pressure to work harder, to achieve more professional success and recognition and financial stature as a way of further proving oneself. And I think that is also can be predicated upon wounding among queer men. So I think that's really important to identify. I also want to weave in some reference. Oh yeah, please.
Sorry, can I just jump in with a recent example of that? My 15-year-old identifies as pansexual and gender fluid. And he recently joined the diversity and equity group at his high school.
Awesome.
Yeah, and he was telling me that this is blows my mind, because I grew up, I'm probably 3 years, 2.5, 3 years younger than you. So also a similar time frame. And
same generation, absolutely.
Yeah, same generation. This would never have happened in our time, right? Okay, so his school.
Right, such a club did not exist when we were kids, right?
No. And what this school initiated, this is like a 1,200 kid normal public high school, okay? In California.
In California, still, of all places, right?
But still,
yeah.
What they did was they sent out a survey to the whole school population, focusing on kids' sense of safety, emotional safety, and they asked kids their identity in terms of race, gender, and those were the two that my 15-year-old focused on. But anyway, what they told me was kids who identified as something other than white, not surprisingly, felt less safe emotionally in the school setting than the white kids. Okay. But what was really off the chart that shocked even my 15-year-old and everyone on this group was that the group of kids who identified as feeling the least safe out of every identity that was, delineated in this survey, were kids who identify as something, kids who labeled their gender as other. Like, so, not cisgender female, not cisgender male, something
non-conforming, non-labeled.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it was a huge, I said, so it was, what percentage of kids labeled themselves as other in terms of gender? And he said, it was a huge number. Okay. Because in this generation, right, especially in California, I don't know, but huge population that is, as you know,
absolutely
coming out as not only having their sexual orientation be something other than
but
straight.
gender identity, yes.
Their gender identity is this huge, huge, huge thing. And even in a school that is so supportive, these kids are not feeling safe.
Right.
Not
so,
cool.
Right. So first
okay.
of all, other was not an option on the check sheet when you and I were kids.
No.
Other was not an option on the check sheet even just 10 years ago.
No. Yeah.
So this is really this is so contemporary. I'm actually really glad you brought that up for a number of reasons. First of all, just identifying contemporarily that gender norms and identity is something that is changing as we speak in society in terms of options, and that may be more non-binary or other. So not just male, not just female, not just trans, not just FTM or MTF, but other, to your point. And as much as our society has evolved in terms of talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, where it is now woven into headlines much on a daily basis in ways that you and I did not have growing up, where it is woven into public education in ways that you and I did not have growing up, except of course in Florida with the Don't Say Gay bill, and that's another whole topic. I don't think we necessarily need to go there, but it's relevant. So I think to name it, and I think Texas is doing something similar. There are a number of other states that are trying to pass similar bills. And for those who may be unfamiliar, what that is about is basically making it illegal on a state level for teachers to make any reference to homosexuality or differences in gender identity, which can include any facets of history, historical characters, people, significant people in pop culture, people who've contributed to society, who may be LGBTQIA, etc., or even for those teachers who may be non-cisgender, heterosexual. They are therefore legally forbidden for making any references to their lives.
Oh, wow.
For kids. And that's what has become known as the Don't Say Gay bill. That's now become state law in Florida, and as I said, has multiple other states who are seeking to copy such a law. In states that may seem to be more progressive around policymaking, around discussion, around inclusion in curriculum, around inclusion in hiring faculty, like in California, like in a lot of different cosmopolitan areas, New York, Boston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, areas that might be seemingly more progressive and so forth. Even still, even in the state of California, I believe it was GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, which has been around for several decades, does education training and outreach for school systems to create more queer-friendly environments that are safer for kids in the schools, has rated the state of California with only a C+ rating. In terms of how safe, how inclusive, how comfortable, and looking at risk factors. So unfortunately, risk factors for queer youth are almost as high now as they were when you and I were kids. So for somebody who's not well versed in the literature and the data, you could sit here and say, what, our society is way more accepting. We've got gay marriage and all that stuff that's been legalized. And there's that gay character who's on, the token gay character who's on that TV show that I watch, and so on and so forth. And yes, certainly there is much more public presentation or public representation and media representation than 30, 40, 50 years ago. However, we still have a really long way to go. Coming back, though, to queer men and divine masculines specifically, I want to just make a couple of bullet points as these expectations and norms may also be experienced for trans men as well.
Mm.
Because I've known any number of trans men, so I'm talking specifically about female to male, those who are born with female bodies who are transitioning or who have transitioned to male gender identity, with or without surgery, with or without hormones, et cetera, and so forth, because there are different gradations in how the extent to which or when and how and the extent to which people transition. But nevertheless, for so many trans men, they too have this set of expectations around how they're supposed to dress, how they're supposed to speak, how they're supposed to express themselves, how they're supposed to style their hair, the extent to which they may have body hair, and so on, like facial hair and body hair, and so on and so forth. So many trans men also feel this sense of pressure, like, okay, if they felt their whole lives like they were born into the wrong body, mm-hmm. which I can only imagine and have empathy for how devastating that would be, but also to have a feeling and a sense of pressure that if you're going to transition, that there is a very specific, more rigid set of characteristics that one therefore must embody in order to be a man.
Right.
So I think that also affects a lot of trans men as well in this discussion that, we're talking about the challenges, the growth, the healing, and the embodiment of the sacred masculine. As a psychological, relational, and spiritual journey, and so on and so forth. So I just want to really be inclusive before we move forward.
And can I just add to that?
By all means, please.
Yeah, and I feel it's like a little awkward because I'm going to speak about transgender women, and I'm not one, and you're not one. So it's, I don't want to put words into,
of course,
experience, but I also have noticed. I mean, I think this applies to all of us. I think everything you're saying in some way applies to all humans, but
absolutely.
In terms of the transgender female experience, I have seen a trend, maybe, again, I don't know statistically how true this is, but I definitely know for some people who, again, are born identified as male and actually identify as female, that they go through, I know personally two, okay, I'm giving an example of two people, but I'm sure it's more than that, who feel early in their life that they need to hyper identify as masculine.
Yes.
And then as they're making the transition into their true identity as a woman, it is, a whole process also that I'm sure involves a lot of what you're speaking to. And
right.
Just on the flip side, just in a different, coming from a different angle, but.
Right, absolutely. I'm really glad you highlighted that. Mm-hmm. With that said, it brings me into a place of hope that with this new generation of adolescents and very young adults who are coming of age, who are more statistically able to identify as pansexual, as non-binary, as other, with regards to gender identity, that maybe some of these people will bring new opportunity for healing around gender identity in society. So I'm going to hold that ray of hope for now.
Yeah.
That, each generation has the potential to bring consciousness raising and healing to society and to the generations that have preceded them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, that's a whole, series. Actually, there are a number of subtopics in there.
Yes.
Going back to queer men, just a very brief kind of historical overview in relatively recent history. So let's just say the last 100 years or so. And certainly there were many generations and cultural contexts going back many thousands of years, and there were many cultural contexts in which homosexuality and changes in gender and gender identity and norms, et cetera, were vastly different. But for argument's sake, let's just take the last 100 years for now, thinking about kind of like from the 1920s, which, you know, the Roaring Twenties, as some people may know, saw a rise in more of like the underground, actually I would say probably even the early, even a little earlier, like the Victorian era from like the 1880s through the 1920s, really right into the years preceding the Second World War, saw a rise in a presence in kind of the underground queer presence. I mean, there were cities in Europe, for example, that had thriving queer culture. Berlin was an LGBT hotspot, as was Paris, as were parts of London, preceding the Second World War. And it was the Holocaust when, you know, LGBTQIA, et cetera, people were persecuted, along with Jews and other groups as well, that really kind of shut all that down. And then, of course, you know, kind of the post-war 1950s society was much more repressed on so many levels, you know, LGBT, et cetera, and other in society, you know, throughout the Western world as well. And, you know, I think that was the era in which you're probably familiar with some of the terms, you know, that queer men often use to kind of keep very subtle codes for, oh, are you a friend of Dorothy's? You know, to try to tease each other out. Dorothy, you know, having been from the Wizard of Oz, and you know, as we know, Judy Garland had a huge gay following, and so on and so forth, and that was sort of how that term came to be. And, you know, even in San Francisco, I mean, a lot of the gay clubs and the drag bars and so on and so forth were centered in the Tenderloin, and West Hollywood saw some of that, and the West Village in New York City saw some of that. I think it was the West End of London as well, kind of like from the 50s into the 60s. And then by the late 60s into the 70s, we had kind of like the sexual revolution and the beginning of the queer revolution. Of course, it was 1969 with Stonewall, which marked the unofficial start of the official, actually I would say the official and unofficial start of the modern movement towards queer rights.
Wow.
Which was in 1969 with, you know, the riot and the police surrounding Stonewall Cafe or Inn in New York City at the time. So we had the beginning of the sexual revolution, and, you know, we had an increase in presence, particularly in urban communities, with the presence of queer men. And that went on for several years, about a decade or so. And then bam, early 80s, what happened? But the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah. And
the overwhelming majority of queer men perished throughout the 80s. The AIDS epidemic literally annihilated a whole segment of the population.
Wow.
So what I think is particularly interesting here is that statistically, there are not a whole heck of a lot of older queer men who are even alive.
Wow, I have never thought about that.
Certainly there are some. And for folks who haven't followed the actual data on this, you know, people might say, oh, well, I know, you know, my uncle or my grandfather or my friend's father. Well, sure, there are some. It's not that like literally every single queer man died, but statistically, the overwhelming majority did.
Wow.
And that included, you know, men who may have been heterosexual identified who had sex with other men.
Right.
Over 1 million people died just during the Reagan era of HIV and AIDS. That's another whole topic. But I think the lack of role models and the fear of HIV and AIDS also further shaped the subsequent generation of newly coming out or coming to terms with queer men, which then was part of my own generation as a Gen Xer.
Right.
Because of course I was an adolescent
right.
as the AIDS epidemic was peaking in the 80s. And my earliest associations of what being gay or even bi as a man meant was you're going to get AIDS and die.
Right.
And actually, when I came out to my mother in the 90s, one of her first responses, actually my mother and a couple of other family members, one of their first responses was expressing fear that I would get AIDS and die. That was their association, not by any fault of theirs, but that was what was presented in the media.
Yeah.
Men who were old enough to live through, or old enough, who are old enough and who were lucky enough to live through and survive the AIDS epidemic, and those of us who came of age during the AIDS epidemic and the immediate years that followed, there were a number of things that happened relationally and culturally. One is that there were a lot of people who partnered up simply for the purpose of safety. If they were in a committed monogamous relationship, at least they had a perceived sense of safety that they weren't going to get AIDS and die, which led to the birth of a lot of kind of codependent relationships and relationships that didn't necessarily have the degree of intimacy or love that people might have hoped for, but there was more of a convenience there.
Wow.
Perhaps not all that dissimilar to heterosexual couples, or maybe a lot of women, especially today and in earlier generations, who stayed with their husbands because the husband was the breadwinner and that was the sense of safety.
Right.
And they couldn't see a way out for reasons of their own survival. Well, the same was true for a lot of queer men. It also brought about a lot of fear of connection for queer men, because that meant, oh man, if I'm gay or something other than heterosexual, what does this mean? And keep in mind, with the AIDS epidemic came a tremendous amount of judgment and scrutiny in society.
Right.
You know, there was a lot of blame on the victims of the disease.
Right.
So I think that really shaped not only the experience, I mean, the trauma and the loss for those people who lived through the AIDS epidemic, but also in the generation that of queer men who came of age kind of through and following it. So I think that's relevant. And, you know, also having grown up with shame and humiliation and bullying and fear of death, and you know, our generation was the first generation of kids to grow up with rising rampant numbers of divorced parents and latchkey kids, and you know, relationship templates starting to get shifted around to begin with, and I think more publicly referenced judgments with the rise of the media and cable TV and so on and so forth of associations of being gay or again, something other than heterosexual, cisgendered, normative. Then following Gen X, what did we have was the coming of age of the millennials. Well, and then of course now Gen Zers. So those guys came of age really much more removed from the AIDS epidemic, much more removed from the death and despair, much more removed from the absence of discussion about what it meant to be queer, gay, with an increasing set of reference points to the possibility of being gay. Not for everyone, certainly, but for a growing number of. And then as the millennials started to come of age, what also happened was the development of, in the pharmaceutical industry, of PrEP, which is preemptive prophylactic use of HIV antiviral medication, which the science and the data shows by taking that regularly, pardon me, it is extremely effective in preventing one from contracting HIV. Then we also had developments in the treatment of people with HIV, where the science in more recent, just in the last 10 years, really, roughly 10 years, where the science has shown that for those who are HIV positive, taking antiretrovirals where they can get their viral load down to a quote unquote undetectable level, then that also seems to show that HIV is therefore not transmittable to other people, or there's very low risk of that. So we've had in the last 10 to 12 years this birth of kind of a new wave of sexual revolution, where you've got these younger adult guys, kind of like the 40 and under crowd, 40 being like the eldest millennials. I read something recently, just a few weeks ago, actually referring to people born between, I think, 1979 and 1982. The term was geriatric millennials. which I thought was hysterical.
Well, I didn't make the cut. I'm too old for them.
No, neither did I. My two sisters did. I texted them. I said, guess what? You guys are geriatric millennials.
Yeah, my sister was born in 79 also. I'm going to have to tell her that. That is
Nevertheless, gosh, these are guys who didn't grow up during the AIDS epidemic. I mean, yeah, they kind of heard about it. And a lot of them grew up with references to gay characters and gay people in the media. And, in a way that has become increasingly normalized. And yes, there are pockets of society that is still clearly very judgmental and very repressed and very ridiculing and very shaming, like the state of Florida, at least from their educational policy enacted in very recent weeks and so forth. However, there's certainly been a change of society. And then with millennials and Gen Zers, we also have the rise in tech culture. First generation of adults who grew up with the instant culture of social media and smartphones and texting and apps, hookup apps and dating apps and Grindr and Scruff and Tinder and all of these different apps. And, another whole conversation has been which would be a separate topic in and of itself, or a separate discussion, but where a whole generation has grown up in some ways void of a kind of social interaction and connection with which you and I grew up as Gen Xers pre-digital age. and every generation before.
Mm.
You know, if you go out to dinner, or if you walk into a cafe or you walk down the street, we all know, look around and everybody's kind of just looking down, staring at their phones. You know, a table of friends having dinner together, they're not interacting with each other, they're not making eye contact, they're staring at their phones. And it's not to say that only millennials and Gen Zers are guilty of that, because certainly older, middle-aged and older adults are as well. But I do think that there is a difference between those of us who grew up without that technology and who came of age socially and relationally without that technology, and those who grew up coming of age, developing the social and relational parts of their psyche with that technology. So I think that's important to flag. So this brings us to the present. Through a whole series of layers of trauma, of disease, of death, of loss, of bullying, of scrutiny, of judgment, of oppression, of isolation, societally, culturally, which could be geographic, it could be cultural, as well as technology. If you put all of these things in context for queer men, it really ups the ante in terms of where, why, how, the ideology of where, why, and how we've got all these risk factors, continue to have all of these risk factors around depression, suicidality, substance abuse, isolation, an excessive amount of casual sex, promiscuity to the point where it's actually shutting off or used as a way of deflecting deeper levels of intimacy. And to be clear, I'm not putting a judgment term on casual sex. I'm not putting a judgment on experimentation sexually or polyamory or anything like that. But I think it's also really important to be very clear from a mental health standpoint, from a relationship standpoint, from an intimacy standpoint, to become very clear about what's driving any given number of choices that we may make, about what's present relationally and what's not. Going back to something that I said at the beginning of the hour, that addiction can unofficially be defined as a lack of connection, a lack of intimacy. And I think that that is something certainly that's rampant in society and culture, but because of a very specific set of wounding that has been inflicted upon queer men, there contextually it's different for queer men than for cisgender heterosexual men or other members of the population. I would even go so far as to say it may even be a little bit more, and I'm actually curious to hear your take on this, it may even be a little bit more acceptable in society for women to be filling traditionally male roles than it is for men to be filling traditionally female roles.
I think that's probably true. Yeah. Well, I mean, think about a male nurse is probably going to be looked down on more than a female doctor, for example. Right.
If a woman doesn't style her hair or wear makeup, she may be less likely to be, for someone to assume that she's queer. Whereas if a man is has a particular style or presentation outwardly, people are much quicker to assume that he must be gay.
Yes, true.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, just, I'm not saying by any means, I want to be really clear about this because I don't want to step on any toes here. I'm not saying that women have it easy in our society. I'm not implying that even for a moment. There are still a lot of struggles. There are still, and my empathy is there. My sensitivity is there for women who are really juggling to be in the workplace and to be in, climbing the corporate ladder and juggling being a mom or not, or the pressure whether to have children or not, and the time frame around that, and the biological clock ticking, and what they can create in their career and their lives in wanting to try to juggle it all. That's a whole other set of struggles that are absolutely relevant, that I'm probably not the best person to give the talk on that, but
no, but it's all,
but it's there.
Right. And one way maybe this could be framed is that the conditioning of patriarchy has impacted every human on the planet in various ways. And everything you just named are ways in which women and men of any sexual orientation have been affected in different ways, right? So,
and I would also flag the discussion of the struggle that so many women have and have had in society over the last 50 plus years. That discussion has been omnipresent.
Yes, right.
The discussion of the struggle that men have around gender identity, expression, and sexuality, particularly if it is a non-heteronormative form, that has not been discussed all that much.
Which is why I almost was crying when you sent me the title of this talk.
Right.
Exactly it. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm thinking of a client who had a day-long or weekend-long retreat with a male friend, and his wife accused him, saying, "You must be gay."
So a male person,
heterosexual male, who took a day retreat because he just wanted a really bonding experience with one of his dearest, closest, most intimate male friends, who also happens to be cisgender, heterosexual identified. And it led to a whole set of accusations from this person's wife that he must be gay.
Oh, wow.
And I don't think that that is so unusual. If a male has a certain presentation or a desire for intimacy or vulnerability or emotional connectedness. Two women took a day retreat or a weekend retreat. Who's going to sit here and say, "Oh, they must be lesbian"? I mean, some people might, maybe.
Right.
But if two men want to connect more intimately on an emotional and relational level, our society is still so riddled with judgment and assumption, which gets into themes of intimacy, themes of vulnerability, and the messaging around what it means to be a man, that if we are vulnerable, if we feel, if we express our feelings, if we cry, if we grieve, if we have an emotional reaction to that, we're being weak. And so much of the work that I do with men therapeutically has to do with beginning to, first of all, create a safe therapeutic outlet for them to be vulnerable, but also to begin to redefine the branding of masculinity, in that there is strength in vulnerability. There is strength in tenderness.
Mm.
There is strength in nurturing.
Mm-hmm.
There is strength in tears and being able to cry,
Mm-hmm.
much less to be able to cry in front of another person.
Mm-hmm.
There is strength in being able to articulate one's more intimate needs to another person. There is strength in being able to acknowledge what is being felt, to name what is being felt, to name what is needed relationally. And that, to me, is all part of the embodiment of the sacred masculine. It's finding strength in vulnerability. It's finding strength in being able to feel. We can still be assertive, we can still be hardworking, we can still, for those who feel inclined to do so, can still be athletic, can still have whatever number of vocal intonations or expressions or a personal style may be right for them, and can be vulnerable, can be compassionate, can have empathy. And that is so important. Clinically, we know that intimacy and deeper connections have the capacity to heal. Clinically, we know that those individuals, regardless of gender or gender identity, sexual orientation, and so forth, we know that human beings who have at least one intimate relationship in our lives, we are more likely to live longer, we are less likely to get sick, we are more likely to be able to weather any number of different life storms that we may encounter, to deal with loss, to deal with unexpected changes, financial ups and downs, disappointments. People who have deeper human relationships have a higher quality of life and a lower risk factor for depression, substance abuse, suicidality, anxiety, and addiction on any number of different levels. Something I've presented in many other talks over the years is that I think we have a society that is very addicted. You know, we're addicted to materialism, we're addicted to our smartphones, we're addicted to media, we're addicted to the 24-hour news cycle, we're addicted to our sense of image, we're addicted to the platform that we have in society, we're addicted to our relationships, we're addicted to sex, we're addicted to drugs, we're addicted to food, we're addicted to sugar and junk food, et cetera, and so forth. We all have something that we just keep going back for more of, even if it's not really filling the deeper, more intimate level of need or yearning that we may have. And that, of course, can be contextualized for queer men. It can be contextualized for men in general. It can be contextualized for society. So I think particularly for queer men, as we learn to embody the sacred masculine, it is absolutely essential that we have an outlet through which we can be heard, through which we can feel, through which we can be deeply honest, through which we can become increasingly self-aware about what's driving our behaviors, our patterns, our fears. And to begin to develop the ego strength, to use a clinical term, to be able to have a set of feelings and create space for a set of feelings, and to begin to implement a self-care set of strategies to respond lovingly and tenderly to those feelings. You know, we use the clinical terms like developing ego strength or the capacity, a greater capacity for emotional regulation. You know, if we were drawing terms from ego psychology or psychodynamic theory. A lot of the, and I want to differentiate a little bit because a lot of folks in New Age circles talk about like ridding yourself of the ego. That is actually not a school of thought that I subscribe to in any way, shape, or form. I really believe that the ego serves a function. It gives us a structure. It gives us an order. It gives us a set of attachments and things that we strive for. It gives us a sense of aliveness, you know, by being attached to a sense of creativity and purpose, something that gives us passion, that gives us something to really to work towards and to create in the world. On some level, that is all ego driven. It's just a higher level of expression of the ego. So just to be clear, as I you know use that particular term, but to develop the ego strength so that we can feel safe enough within ourselves to feel, to express, to respond to what we're feeling in a way that is tender, is loving, is kind, is compassionate, or we're effectively reparenting that inner child, that inner adult, where we can start to be vulnerable enough to seek out relationships of all kinds where we are more honest, we're more open, we're more vulnerable, where we may be more willing to make certain changes in our lives, to reprioritize, to build community, as I said, to deepen our connection with our own spiritual through line, which I think of as being like that sense of, you know, it's almost like our sense of our inner light, in a way that we feel connected to something greater than ourselves. Call it God, spirit, Buddha, the divine, the force, the chi, the energy, the earth, the wind, the sky, the clouds, the ocean, nature, whatever it is. But some kind of higher power, some kind of higher essence that brings us, that gives us meaning, that brings us peace, that brings us a sense of centering, of truth, that helps us align with our truth. And that brings us our calm and into a vibration of love. Returning to that vibration of love with each breath that we take, with each step or engagement in our relationships, in our professional decisions, in our creativity, in our hobbies, in our self-care, in our wellness, with whatever repertoire that may embody. That is all part of embodying the sacred masculine and redefining what gender means, how we excuse me, how we express ourselves sexually, what we seek from sex, what meaning sex holds, and intimacy. Actually, something that I skipped over that I actually just want to go back to very briefly is, thinking about how so many of us get our images and our sense of what sex means from the messages in society, whether it's, a very sexualized media, billboards and magazine ads and ad pop-ups on our social media and television and movies and porn. Men have been surveyed, and actually a very high percentage of men report that their sense of what their concept of what sex is was defined and formed from porn. And that is, of course, very, very limiting. It's based on a very addictive kind of fantasy. It's based on a very objectified use of sex, regardless of the kind of porn or the genders of the people involved in the porn. But it is very objectified. There can be a lot of S&M in it. And of course, the people who are porn performers have an exceedingly high level of substance abuse, are often people who are homeless, who have a lot of addiction in their lives. I've read some material with porn stars of different genders who have been interviewed, talking about how in between scenes, they were literally in the bathroom barfing their guts up because they were so sick by what they had done and the way in which they were objectified.
Really?
And the ways in which they were treated as an object, even by the porn industry, making them believe that they were worthless, that they could so readily and easily be replaced.
Wow.
Which they could. So, that's a piece as well. I think, embodying a healthy relationship with sex and intimacy and what we want from sex and how we relate, how we're able to assert ourselves, how we're able to set our limits, what parameters we create in our relationships, how we're able to listen to another, how we're able to nurture others as well as ourselves, because empathy is certainly a two-way street. Can we hold empathy for another if we also hold empathy for ourselves? It's a lot easier to empathize with another. It comes much more naturally to empathize with another when we have a great deal of empathy and love for ourselves. And, I think as we perhaps bring a level of closure to the talk, I think some of that comes back to the notion of namaste, which I know a term I'm sure you're familiar with, and as are a lot of our viewers. And what namaste really means is that from the light in my soul, I see and honor the light in yours. And to be able to relate in that mutually loving, mutually respectful, mutually tender way of being in the world. So that, in essence and in summary, and of course there are other layers and other subtopics that we could get into in something lengthier, but that in essence is largely, to me anyway, through my own personal journey, through my professional journey, through my observations about the world, my generation, the generations that are following, and the generations that came before me. It's about embodying that love, that strength and vulnerability. That is to embody the sacred masculine.
You need to write that. I'll take that all and put it right into a book. All of that right there.
Yeah.
It will change the world. I'm not kidding.
Thank you. I think that's coming.
Yes.
Look for that within the next couple of years. Yeah.
I'm getting chills. I'm going to cry. It's,
So we'll coin some of the content here.
Yeah.
And hold some copyright on that as well.
Yeah, no.
Copyright Matthew Engel,
Yeah.
MSW,
Yes,
May
definitely.
of 2022.
Definitely. And I have to go in 3 minutes here, because I have to go get my daughter and I have to go get my kids. But anyway, I want to ask one thing, which is, and maybe we need to do a part 2 someday or something, or a part 6 or whatever. But I would love to hear, just, is there any archetype or archetypes in existence that you find to be helpful to you when you're thinking about the sacred masculine? Or do you really just focus on this resonance of love? Or maybe yes and
yes, and that might actually be a great bullet point for the panel discussion that will follow at the end of the symposium.
Yes.
I think I may be on that panel with at least one other astrologer, so that might be a great topic, because astrology is so rooted in archetypes, as is tarot and myth, and literature.
And actually, I'm going to be, another astrologer who is going to be speaking, his name is Eric Roth. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a shamanic astrologer. He's going to be doing a talk on the sacred masculine in various forms. And I'll see if your times coincide. But yes, this needs a part, at least a part 2.
Now that archetypal question about archetypes, I think is very on point. I think, and very worthy of further discussion. And I would love to have some group dialogue with other speakers about that in a couple weeks.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay.
I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing light of this topic and all of the other wonderful topics. I was just last night reading the updated roster of the other speakers, and I just feel really deeply honored to be among this group of speakers in the symposium. So thank you for being such a needed balm or salve in our society and in our world.
Aw, thank you. Well, and I feel like I should just say one last thing, which is, earlier today I channeled a message in a video, and one of the things that came through was talking about how astrologically Saturn is squaring the nodes of the moon through a lot of this year, and it just squared the eclipse that we had last night. We're recording this on May 16th, 2022. Anyway, so what's making me think of you is, the message was that we associate Saturn with conditioning, and what the spirits who were speaking through me today said was, the essence of that Saturnian structure is really in its pure form is only love. That's all it is. So what they were saying was, if there is any sense of should that comes up in you, just take a moment and notice if, when you really get quiet with that should, if it's coming from that pure love. And if it is, great. If it's not, let it go. So I mean, again, this comes back to that, divine masculine, divine whatever, but
divine whatever,
divinity, divine. Certainly the way you're speaking to the divine masculine is.
I think that's actually a really good point. I think I believe anyway that Saturn also has a masculine or father principle, and I think that would actually be a great topic if we're talking about archetypes. Also, you had asked me at the beginning, just before we finish up, if folks are wanting to be in contact with me. My website is matthewengel.com, Hewengel. I am based in San Francisco. However, I work 100% remotely, mostly through Zoom and also by phone. I have a little bit of availability at this time for psychotherapy, for coaching, and astrology. The podcast show that I hosted for several years is still out there on most podcast forums. You can look it up, Intuitive Transformation Radio. You can go to my website, matthewengel.com to sign up for my newsletter. And as mentioned, I am currently in process working on an online astrology school with Tara Sutphen, who is a world-renowned metaphysical teacher, author, astrologer, and so much more. What we're creating is a series of topic-centered talks, almost like a talk show, but on different astrology topics. So these are talks that we're giving that are recorded, that'll all be available for online download. And then we're also creating more of a school where I think we're going to get into astrology basics. And what I'm also have in the works is an online platform for hypnotherapy and guided meditation recordings and personal development curriculum, which is going to be launched in the next several months. So if you sign up for my newsletter on my website, matthewengel.com, you'll get info about that. I'm licensed to provide psychotherapy for people residing in California and in Massachusetts, but I certainly can provide therapeutic coaching to folks who are elsewhere. So again, thank you so much for creating this opportunity for such really important dialogue.
Yeah,
exchange of energy.
And the last thing I'll just say about you, one of the many things I appreciate about you, but I just want to highlight for people, is that you're one of the few people I know who both have that connection and awareness with the spiritual world, but also the grounding and the clinical background and the deep knowledge of how to approach our healing in a trauma-informed way, because every being on this planet has trauma. It's just a very traumatic place to be.
Yes, absolutely.
And as you and I have talked about, that is so important to me and important to you.
Absolutely, most definitely.
Yeah,
I love that you added that.
Yeah, however we are called to hold healing space in this world, that we do it in a very careful way that acknowledges and is able to address the trauma that exists in a competent, safe way. And I know, anyway, I love that you bring all of that to the world. And
relational and societal trauma are marked forms of trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.